Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel. Nate on the Stone with my co-producer Toby, who is busily chewing over some bones of contention there in the corner. We are both here today for another edition of the Rolling Stone. Last Saturday, October 30th, was the 286th birthday of probably the most forgotten famous American of the Revolutionary period. Second President John Adams. And I say most famous forgotten person because in spite of a Pulitzer Prize winning biography published in 2001, a mini-series issued or made 5 years later starring some pretty serious and pretty well-known character actors like Paul Giamatti and Laura Linney, John Adams still has not... there was not a resurgence of interest, really, in John Adams, in his thinking, in his writing after that. Oh, there certainly was in academia. David McCullough's book, the mini-series, it all went together to create a little uptick in interest in Adams, in his work. And there were different academic books published concerning John Adams' early life, John Adams and his relationships, his thoughts on democracy, John Adams and his political philosophy, John Adams and religion. Basically, a lot of different aspects of Adams' thought were then scrutinized in book form. But that popularity did not sink down into the popular consciousness. And I think the reason for that is because, for better or worse, 21st century Americans are a Jeffersonian people. In some ways that's good. In a lot of ways it's very, very bad, because Thomas Jefferson was the eternal optimist, even when he had no right to be. Just look at his continued bulldogish defense of the French Revolution. Adams was much more of a realist. He was much more rooted in philosophy, religion, history, and so he knew utopia is not going to happen here. Man is a fallen creature. Every time you try to say, oh, this will finally bring peace and prosperity to the entire world forever and ever, you have problems. And what's interesting is that in 1776, the very year of our birth, the birth of the United States, remember July 4th, 1776, the Battle of Trenton and all that good stuff, John Adams wrote very pessimistically, quote, "I have seen all along my life such selfishness and littleness, even in New England, that I sometimes tremble to think that although we are engaged in the best cause that ever employed the human heart, yet the prospect of success is doubtful, not for want of power or of wisdom, but of virtue." So in other words, in 1776, before the colonial forces had even successfully won their independence from Great Britain, John Adams is thinking, this thing might be doomed from the start. Not because we don't have the power, not because we don't have the wisdom, but because we don't have the virtue. And that word virtue is particularly important because so often today we think of virtue in a very narrow, very little sense. We think of virtue as applying only to matters of sex. And then if you use virtue in relation to sex, well, you've automatically branded yourself a prude, a Puritan, a curmudgeon, an old man, an old maid before your time. In the 18th century, however, as in so many other things, they had a much better, a much richer and deeper understanding of what virtue meant. For people of the 18th century, men and women, when you spoke of virtue, you were talking about the 4 classical virtues: courage, justice, prudence, and temperance, and the 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. Because, as aggravating as it is for some people to have someone actually admit it, yes, we may not have been founded as specifically a Christian nation. If you mean by that we were founded as a theocracy, if you mean by that we were founded with a national church, like what happened in France, in Germany, in England, in most cases in Europe, but we were a Christian country. in that the vast supermajority of people, we're talking 98% of the population, 96 to 98%, were Christian of some denomination. And moreover, it was just a given that the Christian religion was needed for this whole experiment in self-government to actually work. On a broader note in the 18th century, but going from that, virtue also meant that you could not be licentious, which is a word that we've used here before on the stone and which has really fallen out of favor in the general population. Licentiousness was freedom run rapid. That's the best way to think of it. If liberty, one of the things that the American revolutionaries were fighting for, if liberty was a sacred fire, as George Washington put it in his first inaugural address, then that fire was a bonfire. And what is a bonfire? It's contained. It's in a fire pit or some sort of other enclosure, whether that's just, a dirt pit, etc., in order to keep the fire contained. Because if the fire actually leaves the bonfire and spreads out into the rest of the woods, the rest of the fields, you don't have a bonfire anymore. You have a wildfire on your hands, which is going to destroy everything. All of a sudden, that bonfire around which you were singing and talking and drinking and making s'mores could very possibly destroy your house and the houses of all your neighbors, plus destroy all the grass that your neighbors' cattle feed upon. So that was the difference. The bonfire was ordered liberty, licentiousness was the wildfire. And everyone in the 18th century agreed that a licentious people could not actually maintain their liberty. It would automatically dissolve into a despotism. If you weren't virtuous, if you just said, I'm free, I can do whatever, I don't have to listen to anyone, does that sound familiar? Then you were already headed along the road to serfdom, as Hayek famously put it, because you lacked virtue. Well, the sad news today is that there is no virtue anymore. There is absolutely no vestige even of virtue where it counts. I'm not saying that every single person of the, what is it now, 300 million, 330 million, 350 million, 400 million, 500 million, who knows how many Americans we're going to have, natural Americans we're going to have, now that the southern border has been completely dissolved. Talk about a lack of virtue there. But the institutions of power, the people in power, whether that's in government, in academia, in the culture, and the institutions that they run, have no virtue. And what's more to the fact, they've chucked it overboard. They think that virtue is an impediment to their goals, and in that sense, they are right. And we've talked about this before, gang, but let me just give a few examples if you want to know just how bad it's gotten. The Loudoun County School District, we now know, covered up a rape that took place in one of its schools. A quote-unquote gender-fluid student who was biologically male and who still had all of his plumbing underneath the skirt that he wore, anally raped a girl in the bathroom. Now, not only did the school cover up the rape, not only did they quietly transfer the quote-unquote gender-fluid student to another school where he committed another sexual assault 2 months later, but then the school actually arrested the girl's father after he protested at one of these parent-school board confrontations that have been popping up all over the country, and God bless the people who have actually been doing that and keeping that fire going. This is from townhall.com. Loudoun County, when you cover up alleged rapes, you can expect these sort of things to happen. This was written by Matt Vespa, and he says, what's happening in Loudoun County, Virginia would be national news if it weren't for the liberal media hoping it suffers a quiet death. The school board appears to be involved in multiple rape cover-ups at their schools. One such incident occurred in May where a 14-year-old was brutally assaulted in a bathroom. The attacker was a quote-unquote gender-fluid student wearing a skirt. The girl's father was arrested at one of the meetings protesting critical race theory being part of the annual curriculum. The family of the victim has filed legal action. It also doesn't help that the attacker pretty much lied about the encounter. This has had serious consequences for the school district in Loudoun County. One of the administrators of Loudoun County School District resigned. She had to resign because of the pressure on her. Other people on the board now are trying to weasel out of it by saying, oh, when people ask me, if there had been assaults in the bathrooms before because of our policy of having bathrooms be segregated by identity and not by biology, oh, I misheard the question. Could have happened to anyone. Sorry. Which doesn't at all explain why you covered up the rape in the first place. And it's not even just about the rape in the bathroom, gang. It's the fact that the people you trust, these school administrators, people who parents trusted to ensure their children's safety 5 days out of the week when they were in school, decided that sexual assaults and anal rapings were a price that they were willing to pay. It was a necessary sacrifice in order to keep the narrative going. That trans students pose absolutely no threat to other students, and trans women pose absolutely no threat to real women. That's what's going on there. Barack Obama, stumping for Terry McAuliffe, the happily defeated gubernatorial candidate of Virginia, defeated largely because parents saw this happening and saw McAuliffe not take this seriously, actually called the covering up of rape a fake culture war. That's the former 44th President of the United States. A 14-year-old girl getting anally raped by a gender-fluid student is a fake culture war outrage. Oh, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, gang. Shall we take a look at Joe Biden? Joe Biden recently went to a climate summit of world leaders in Edinburgh, and he took a motorcade with him, flew a motorcade over to Europe. You want to know how many cars were in Joe Biden's motorcade? 85. Which is more than a 50% increase from Barack Obama's biggest motorcade, which was 40 cars. And not only that, not only did Joe Biden actually simply fly this 85 car motorcade to Europe, he flew it to Europe twice. He stopped in Rome to meet Pope Francis before the climate summit, meaning that this motorcade had to fly from Washington, D.C. to Rome, and then from Rome, it flew to Edinburgh, Scotland, which is where the summit was being held, and then it had to be flown back to Washington, D.C. In total, as per the Daily Mail, Joe Biden generated 2.2 million pounds of carbon to attend this climate change summit in Scotland after President Joe Biden was snapped in a gas-guzzling 85-car motorcade in Rome. 2.2 million pounds of carbon by one man who is such a gigantic wanker on the world stage that he thought that he had to have 85 cars in his motorcade. It's a status. The term compensating for something. Well, this is the administration compensating for the fact that Joe Biden not only isn't the legitimate president of the United States, but even if he was, he is a complete, utter fraud of a president because he's not there. The few presidents, prime ministers, and world leaders who actually had the honor to have face-to-face time with Biden said that he was completely out of it. He had absolutely no clue what he was talking about. Not only that, he was reading his speech on the teleprompter, which, okay, again, is not a big deal because most world leaders now read from a teleprompter, but he was so out of it that he read parts of his teleprompted speech twice. Had no clue that he was actually reading it twice. Now, this not only, and with that, the lack of virtue can be seen not only in Joe Biden, but in all the other little wankers surrounding the great big wanker, which is Biden, maintaining the story, maintaining the farce, that this man is actually the president of the United States, that Joe Biden is actually the head of the government, the head of the executive branch. Not only that, but the fact that Joe Biden can blow through 2.2 million pounds of carbon, while at the same time you are being told that you're just going to have to suck it up, little buddy, with $3.18 gas as the national average. Some places it's $3.30. In some places it's inching close to $4. You're just going to have to get used to that because you know what? You can't drive as much because the planet is in danger of burning to a crisp because you selfishly drove your family onto a camping trip last summer. The elites have their rules. The little people do not. Joe Biden and all of his successors will still be able to live the good life. They'll be eating red meat. They'll be flying to Europe. They'll be having 100, 200 car motorcades to compensate for their lack of male parts. You, on the other hand, will be probably stuck in some decaying neighborhood because gas will be so high, even if you could find a buyer for your house, which is now in a decaying, decrepit neighborhood, the gas would be so expensive it would take what you could make from selling your house to actually get to a new location, which of course means that you wouldn't be able to buy a new one after you got there. Oh, but it's not just the elites, gang. It's not just the elites. In true domino fashion, the lack of any sort of virtue among our elites, among our institutions, has finally sunk down to the common level. And you can see this in a multiple of different ways. Did you hear about how we, the United States, lost a $2 billion warship because of a fire that no one could put out? It actually happened. This is from militarynews.com, or .eu, I should say. Navy probe finds major failures in fire that destroyed USS Bonhomme Richard. A Navy report has concluded there were sweeping failures by commanders, crew members, and others that fueled the July 2020 arson fire that destroyed the U.S. Bonhomme Richard, calling the massive 5-day blaze in San Diego preventable and unacceptable. While one sailor has been charged with setting the fire, the more than 400-page report obtained by the Associated Press lists 36 officers and sailors whose failings either directly led to the ship's loss or contributed to it. The findings detailed widespread lapses in training, coordination, communication, fire preparedness, equipment maintenance, and overall command and control. It slammed commanders of the amphibious assault ship for poor oversight and said the main firefighting foam system wasn't used because it hadn't been maintained properly and the crew didn't know how to use it. The report describes the ship in disarray with combustible materials stacked, scattered, and stored improperly. It said maintenance reports were falsified, that 87% of the fire stations on board had equipment problems or had not been inspected. It also found that crew members did not ring the bells and alert sailors that there was a fire until a full 10 minutes after it was discovered. Those crucial minutes, the report said, caused delays in crews putting on fire gear, assembling hose teams, and responding to the fire. Sailors also failed to push the button that would have activated the firefighting foam system, even though it was accessible and could have slowed the progress of the fire. No member of the crew interviewed considered this action or had specific knowledge as to the location of the button or its function, the report said. So in other words, $2 billion of our bucks went up in smoke last year while our attention was all on Antifa, BLM, and all the other domestic terrorists burning down our cities and toppling statues, while our attention was fixed on that, $2 billion of our money went up in flames because the crewmen, not just the higher-ups, not just the officers, the regular crewmen of our military don't know how to stop a fire on a ship that is their home for a considerable portion of the year. That is how bad it has gotten. Now, the $6,400 question, of course, to all this, gang, is what is the appropriate response to this? What actually is the appropriate response? What does virtue demand in order for it to be reinstated into society? Because no matter where you are on the political spectrum, whether you are becoming ever more and more radicalized, like I am, yours truly, whether you consider yourself part of the mainstream right, whether you consider yourself a part of the left, if you have eyes that are actually open to objective reality, which is getting harder and harder to have, whether you're on the right or left, because everyone is burrowing down under these secondary Gnostic narratives, because it's so much easier to create a narrative whereby you create a problem so that you can say, we just need to fix this, instead of the real problem, because the fake problem that you have created in your secondary reality is, of course, much easier to fix than the actual problems here in the real world. But no matter where you are on the political spectrum, if you have eyes that are open to objective reality, it is very hard to maintain now that a lack of virtue has been anything other than disastrous for this country, for our civilization, for our way of life. And this isn't to say that every single person in society has to be canonized as a saint while they're still alive. No. That has never happened. That is never going to happen, because going back to Adam's, human nature is fallen. You're always going to have scumbags and deadbeats and predators amongst you. You're also going to have a lot of people who are just flaccid. They're still water. Their natural inclination, or simply their mentality because of a process of osmosis from the wider culture, is to sink down to the lowest common denominator. I can sit down and watch Netflix and play video games all day and just cash in my welfare checks because, you know what, everyone else is doing it. That's all that you need for a good life. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. That's what everyone is saying. So that's what I'm going to do. When you have that, all right, when you have those sort of mentalities, those sort of premises that are not just on the fringe, they're not in the mainstream competing with other premises and other ideas, but when those premises dominate a society, like they do now, you can see how the lack of virtue has brought us to this point of decay. So the big question is, again, the $6,400 question is, what do you do to actually reverse the process? How do you reestablish virtue into society? Now, you would think that conservatives, the American conservative movement, would actually be on the forefront of this issue, because this is one of the serious questions, one of the serious problems that faces us. Our problems today aren't so much big government. They're not so much the rate of taxation. They're not so much any of those things. Yes, those are problems. But one of the main problems is this lack of virtue. Properly understood, again. So you would think that the right would be chomping at the bit, wanting to get out and actually say, here's the problem, here's a solution. Here's a problem, here is an answer. But they are not, because unfortunately the right is just as full of wankers and deadbeats and parasites as the left is. I used to be naive and think, okay, the world is, pretty simply divided. People on the left, at best, they're deluded. At best, they're ignorant. And at worst, they're just liars and thieves. And on the right, okay, maybe not everyone on the right is an Einstein. Maybe not everyone on the right is a John Adams. Maybe not everyone on the right is an Orestes Brownson, another Cicero, another Edmund Burke, another John C. Calhoun. But you know what? Mostly good, decent people who want to do the right thing. I don't believe that anymore. Going back to what I said about secondary realities being prominent on both the left and the right. Just to give you a couple of examples, gang. Reason Magazine, which styles itself as a magazine for free minds and free markets, can't admit that the Virginia gubernatorial election that was just held this past week had anything to do about school boards or gender fluid students anally raping 14-year-old girls. Headline from Nick Gillespie, who is one of the senior editors over at Reason. It's still the economy, stupid, not critical race theory or trans bathrooms. One of the hardest political lessons to learn is that pocketbook issues are the main driving force of electoral successes and failures. No, it's not. No, it's not. Because if that actually were true, Barack Obama would have lost in 2012. Joe Biden would not have won in 2020. If actually that was the case. In another piece from Reason, they were how do I put it? They were connecting Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, who, by the way, is one of my senators, and I'm very proud to have one of the few senators in that decaying body of 100 old husks. I am proud to have one of the few senators who is actually serious about governing. Reason was comparing him, Josh Hawley, to the Chinese Communist Party because he is quote-unquote fretting about manhood. This in an environment where the American Psychological Association has termed traditional masculinity as a public health crisis because it is quote-unquote toxic. You don't simply dismiss people who are serious about defending the primordial building blocks of a society. Okay? Those people aren't serious. The people who attack the people who are trying to defend those primordial building blocks, at best they're not serious and are going to get you killed. At worst, they're no better than the left because they themselves don't actually want public virtue to come back. They don't want the 4 classical virtues. They don't want the 3 theological virtues because, heavens above, that might actually curb their freedom of having infinite choices in every single splinter of life. But it gets even worse than that, gang, because this has forced the right. It has forced the right to thread a very difficult needle. Listen to what happened at Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA event where he was exposing critical race theory when it went to question and answer.
I want to ask you something a little bit out of the ordinary, so prepare yourself. At this point, we're living under corporate and medical fascism. This is tyranny. When do we get to use the guns? No, and I'm not, that's not a joke. I'm not saying it like that. I mean, literally, where's the line? How many elections are they going to steal before we kill these people?
So, no, no, hold on. No, stop, hold on. Now, I'm going to denounce that. I'm going to tell you why. Because you're playing into all their plans, and they're trying to make you do this. That's okay. Just hear me out. You started with a compliment, so at least give me a little bit. They are trying to provoke you and everyone here. They are trying to make you do something that will be violent, that will justify a takeover of your freedoms and liberties, the likes of which we have never seen. We are close to have, hold on, we are close to have momentum to be able to get this country back on a trajectory using the peaceful means that we have at us. So to answer your question, and I just think it's, overly blunt, we have to be the ones that do not play into the violent aims and ambitions of the other side. They fear, let me say this very clearly, they fear us holding the line with self-control and discipline, taking over school board meetings. They're the ones that are willing to use federal force against us. And I know that people get fired up. We are living under fascism. We are living under this tyranny. But if you think for a second that they're not wanting you to all of a sudden get that next level where they're going to say, okay, we need Patriot Act 2.0. If you think that, Waco is bad, wait till you see what they want to do next.
So, according to Mr. Kirk, we're living under fascism, we're living under tyranny right now. Those things aren't coming down the turnpike. We are actively living under fascism and tyranny, but at the same time, it's not actually time to take the next step. It's not time. The American revolutionaries started shooting way before gender-fluid British soldiers started anally raping little girls in the one-room schoolhouse. Just a little observation of mine. But Nate, you might be saying, Youngkin won in Virginia. He won the gubernatorial election. These, special elections, they were a sweep for Republicans. Democrats are in disarray. What's going on? Can't we just vote these people out? Well, no. No, you can't. Because first of all, if you actually look at the exit polls, Youngkin won by 50.9%. McAuliffe came in with 48.4%, meaning that Youngkin won by the skin of his teeth, less than 2% of the vote, meaning that 48.4% of the people who voted in this week's Virginia gubernatorial election were perfectly fine with school boards covering up anal rape in order to preserve the narrative. They were perfectly fine with Terry McAuliffe saying that parents have absolutely nothing to do with the education of their children. They had absolutely no problem with McAuliffe saying that there have to be racial quotas in the workforce. Listen to this.
And I promise you, we've got to diversify our teacher base here in Virginia. 50% of the students in Virginia schools, K-12, 50% are students of color, and yet 80% of the teachers are white. We all know what we have to do in a school to make everybody feel comfortable in school.
At its best, voting prevents these people from obtaining power. But again, that does not actually solve the underlying problem. How do you actually stop them from thinking this? And I know that people are going to say that sounds absolutist, that sounds authoritarian, that sounds totalitarian. We don't want people to stop thinking anything if they so choose. That's what makes us different from the left. I'm here to say, gang, that when almost 50% of the electorate of any state thinks that it's justified in public officials covering up sexual assault, sexual battery, rape, then that is a serious problem. That is not only a serious problem, that is a monstrous problem. The problem, however, on our side, which I hinted at just a moment ago, is that too many people on the right are afraid of virtue. They are actually afraid. They're not afraid of the word, but they're actually afraid of what will happen if we actually got serious about declaring that, no, you need a virtuous public square. You can't just have a public square that celebrates choice in the marketplace of ideas and lifestyles, etc., etc. No. There need to be concrete parameters along some of these edges, because otherwise you're going to go into the ditch and you are going to die and decay, and you'll probably deserve it. They're terrified of this. This past summer, there was a huge blow up in right-wing Twitter when it was discovered that Turning Point USA actually kicked out the porn performer Brandy Love from attending as a VIP this specific event in Florida under her own porn brand of Brandy Love. She didn't come under her own given name. She came under her performance name. And there was a huge debate. There was a huge, not just a debate, there was actual vitriol being spewed by the people who said that this was the most terrible thing to ever happen to the right, because we had just shown that we were just as closed-minded and intolerant of people with differing lifestyles, etc., etc., and then as the left. We were no different than the left. Never mind that a porn performer who is pushing 50, any porn performer actually, has no business being at a conservative event that is billing itself as primarily for teenagers. 15, 16, 17-year-olds. Has no business whatsoever going there. But anytime you try to actually make that case, you are branded as a Puritan, a bigot, a prude, etc., etc., or even a black shirt, a fascist, a totalitarian, I should know, because some of those comments were directed at me. So instead, what the right is trapped in is this secondary reality where if we're just patient, we're going to inevitably win. We are going to inevitably win, like Glenn Beck tried to argue last week.
So D. Parker wrote The Case for Optimism, 10 Reasons Why the Pro-Freedom Right Will Defeat the Anti-Liberty Left. He said, the leftist enemies of freedom and civil rights are such that it makes it impossible for them to win. And while it would be a disaster if they were to befall the planet, it would be still hard to be positive. It is still hard to be positive when it's a steady diet of doom and gloom every day. Every day brings yet another attack on freedom and progress from people falsely labeling themselves as liberals. So it is 8% trying to sway the rest using cultural norms. We are 25%. If we just get smart, we can affect and sway a lot more people. That's why they're trying to shut anyone who is effective at it down. That's why you don't see effective conservatives on television or any place else. Nobody who is effective is going to be on Netflix or Amazon. That's just the way it is. However, they're doing damage. The 8 to 10% are so far left that they are overplaying their hand, and they're exposing themselves and exposing conservatives as the ones who had it right the whole time.
Beck and everyone else on the American right really should remember the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy does not just naturally go away. It has to be physically turned into order of some kind for it to actually stop being a threat. Because if you just wait, if you just say, this will fly away, people are smart, people are educated, people are good, it'll blow away, it'll be fine, the entropy is going to consume you. And you know what, gang? If we don't do something now about this, if we don't start asking these hard questions, if we don't actually start thinking about the big picture, going back to Basics 101, it is going to swallow us. Like the dragon in the fairy tales. The white knight will have thought, yeah, the dragon, he'll get tired pretty soon of eating virgins. I don't have to do anything. Just wait. Just wait. And whoop. The dragon just had you for dessert. But anyway, gang, I have talked too long as usual. So, I and Toby are going to wish you a very good rest of the day. Have a great weekend. Have a happy weekend. Stay safe, stay free by daring to read, think, speak, and write. And I will chat at you later. Ciao.